All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach, and I work with the team here at BPI. And today I have the great honor of bringing you the first episode of our new webinar series. In this episode, I'll be sitting down with Margot and Troy, two of our BPI fellows, to discuss their most recent Bitcoin mining report. Before we jump in, I do want to quickly thank the Cornell Brooks Tech Policy Institute for their partnership on this series. And without further ado, let's jump right in. What did your research look like before BPI, and what does it kind of look like now, and how has the support from BPI sort of changed things for you?
Well, okay, I'll start because Troy looks unsure. But my research actually changed quite a bit so Bitcoin mining was sort of in this path. But I originally started my PhD in the physics department, and I was doing research on I was doing something called robophysics, where I was building robotic models and studying sand locomotion of lizards and snakes. And my dream goal was to get back to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and work there and send more rovers to Mars, which is what I had done before I went to grad school. And then, and then I started really getting very concerned about climate change and feeling like my research was kind of pointless. And I wanted to make a bigger impact. So I switched departments. I ended up in civil engineering and was working on climate modeling. And then a lot of things happened. The pandemic happened, and spent a lot of time thinking about climate change and inaction on climate change. And I had already been using Bitcoin for a few years prior to that. And I had this epiphany about using Bitcoin as a climate activist and got really into understanding Bitcoin mining, since that's really one of the big barriers to really appreciating Bitcoin if you come from a climate background. And I just got so into it. And now my research is really focused on Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining's energy use, environmental impacts. So I do have a engineering science background, but the research is really different from what I started doing.
Yeah, my story is a little different. I've always just thought broadly about a lot of things. And I guess my research and philosophy is in metaphysics and epistemology. And that hasn't really changed so much. I'm an obsessive and I'm a curious person. And I don't even really think of research as its own special category. I like learning things. I like talking to people who know stuff that I don't. And I think the thing that brought me to the fore, actually, it was before I found BPI, was this idea that I had and developed with Andrew Bailey, another BPI fellow and philosopher, about how to hold Bitcoin in a carbon neutral way. And so at that point, I was already down the rabbit hole of thinking about the environmental impacts of Bitcoin mining, energy use of Bitcoin mining. Some part of the way down that rabbit hole, had a cool idea and I wanted to share that idea. That's why I went public as a Bitcoiner. I was a private Bitcoiner up until that point. And that's what brought me to David's attention and brought me to BPI. So I had already made the shift to, thinking about stuff you're not supposed to think about. And across the whole range of Bitcoin stuff too, that not just energy issues, but really Bitcoin is connected to so many issues, and all of them drew me in intellectually. I've done a lot of my thinking not in research journals, but just publicly on Twitter. Some of that has been in the last 2 years learning about energy systems because they're really complicated, and still I don't know much about them after spending a lot of time on it. Still don't feel like I understand a lot. So I don't know. I don't want to put myself on a pedestal as some kind of researcher. I'm just a curious person. I learn in public. I like sharing things with other people that I do know or learning together. I feel like it's what I do in a classroom. I feel like it's what I do at conferences in philosophy. It's all one giant soup of learning. BPI didn't really change any of that. It did pay for me to go to some conferences that I wouldn't have gone to otherwise. That was nice. I got to talk to more people, learn from more people, teach more people. So I think uh, B- BPI as a vehicle is kind of it's been great for me to meet the fellows, to have a lot of conversations that I wouldn't have had. A lot of what BPI does, and people listening to this podcast should understand this, is not visible from the website. We have a lot of conversations uh, with lawmakers, regulators that are not public, and we write things for them that are not public. Uh, so the educational task that's happening like behind the scenes is a big part of BPI. A lot of BPI's biggest wins are things that people will never know about. Um, I, I've, and if I can just say this, I mean, uh, I am constantly surprised by how little people understand about the stuff that Margot and I do, Bitcoin mining and energy in the policy space. Like the level of ignorance is really high, even among people who think they know stuff. People are at square one, basically. People are at square one. And so we're part of an educational effort that meets people where they are. And some of that's like writing a report like this, but a lot of it is just having conversations with people who are in a position to regulate, but this is one of like 1,000 things that they think about, and they really know nothing or next to nothing about it, except they've read some headlines. So I think, BPI has helped me to meet those people and have those conversations. That's been very rewarding and valuable.
Yeah, 100%. I think, obviously all of the stuff that we publish online and on Twitter and on, our official channels, that's all public facing. And at the same time, there's a lot that's going on in the background that, maybe doesn't necessarily need to be public because, we are sort of catering to that target audience, which is, again, those people with the regulatory and lawmaking power. So yeah, I think that's a great point. And then, just shifting gears a little bit to jump into this report that we've been dancing around now. Troy, can you just get us started quickly by talking about sort of like the original impetus for the report? Was this sort of a fighting the FUD? Was this, hey, we've seen too many people who really don't understand how these systems work?
We had already been well into the FUD fighting mode for a long time. We'd done a lot of debunking, and a lot of people across the Bitcoin space have done that debunking. In fact, lawmakers, while I just said they don't know much about mining, like they told us that they have heard the talking points of the Bitcoin mining community. They didn't really trust any of that. So they had heard that Bitcoin mining was flexible, a flexible load, that it's good for grids, that it uses renewable energy, like the Bitcoin Mining Council statistics. They just didn't believe any of that stuff. They didn't have credible data backing up the claims that miners were making. So really, Margot and I set out to do something different that hasn't been done, and that is gather real world data and see what it tells us about whether Bitcoin miners actually do what they say they do. They make a lot of promises, but the data that they shared originally was, or aggregated, was just not credible. It wasn't vetted by a third party. It wasn't detailed at all. And we just heard that people didn't believe it. And so it was a bunch of narratives kind of hanging in thin air. So the point of this report was to try to do the thing which, turned out to be very, very hard. And that is to ground those narratives in reality, whatever that reality turned out to be.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, going to flip it over here to Margot. Margot, could you just elaborate a little bit on what the actual process of collecting the data looked like? Maybe you want to give us some horror stories if you want, or not. But yeah, just curious about like what that process actually, looked like.
Well, it was a lot of emails and a lot of getting people to send emails, do introductions. Really, Troy and I just thinking like, who do we know? Who can we talk to? And I kept a list of like 40 companies, 40 or so companies, yeah, that I was regularly trying to get in contact with, because there's different stages. There's the getting the intro, then getting them to respond. They may not. Okay, they do respond. They agree to a meeting. We get the meeting. Okay, then there's the will you share data with us stage, and they may not. They may not because they are skeptical of what we're doing, even though we have given the best pitch we possibly can about how we're going to protect their data. Nobody's going to know who they are, and this is all really for their benefit. Like, still, that doesn't always work. It's not always so convincing. But then, okay, they agree. They say yes. Then you have to get the data from them. And that's a whole other process, which takes time, because then they may say yes, and then you never hear from them again. And we had a few companies like that. Or it turns out, oh, we can't get the data, or it's just like a constant back and forth. They want you to sign off on this or that, and so that they really trust that they can just sue you if something goes wrong. So it is a lot of people dealing with people more than anything for the majority of the process. And someone like myself, I don't like to deal with people, so this was sometimes very painful for me. like waking up in the morning and think, oh my god, I have to send emails again. No, I don't want to do this. But in the end, it really paid off. So it's a really difficult process. It's the most important process, is that, getting in touch with people, getting them to share their data. But it is, painful, but really high reward. And I think what Troy and I did is something no one else has been able to do up to this point. And I would say even in data centers in general, it's hard to do what we did, to be able to pull from within our own network, and to do it because we have been there, meeting the companies where they're at, engaging with them, building our own reputation and trust, and using and leveraging that. It's something that a lot of people do this kind of research cannot do. So we're really lucky. And I think part of that is that this is a really small space in terms for Bitcoin mining. People know each other. One person, they can introduce you to like 5 other people, and it just fans out from there. It's just very small, and it's very easy to get everyone in the same room. So I think we're really lucky to be in a position like that, and that helped us to get through the most difficult part of what we did.
And I'll say, Margot did the lion's share of this relationship building and data gathering, and her research also, for her PhD, relies on this kind of relationships. And as a researcher, you're always worried about being scooped, I guess, on the journal front. And I'm really not worried about anybody scooping Margot because we now know how hard it is to get actual data. And it's like, good luck to anyone else. Good luck. And I mean that sincerely. Good luck. Maybe you can also do this. But I also just think the probability of you getting anything done in a timely fashion is very, very low. I will also say that the problems with data gathering also affect which questions we could meaningfully address with the data. So when you are like begging people for data and taking what you can get, you're not guaranteed a representative random sample of mining, right? You don't have a comprehensive data gathering. That would be like all the miners in the world. Like, good luck doing that. No one's going to be able to do that. You're also not going to be able to be assured of randomness, because you might get some miners who are, who feel they'll be misportrayed or whatever. Those miners might not share. Other miners that are proud of what they're doing might be more generous with their data. So we were stuck methodologically with trying to figure out which questions would not require a comprehensive or a random sample of data, right? So that's the kind of study design we had to address a question that would honestly convey what we found and not more than what we found. And that's why we went with the question that we tried to answer, which was like, how flexible are miners in general? How often do they turn off? And what kind of impact does that flexibility actually make on emissions for those miners that we studied? We can speculate on that basis about mining as a whole if our sample is representative as a further step. But the questions were limited to things that we could actually support with a non-random sample of miners.
Right, totally. Yeah, I think even as an outsider, looking in, I can just imagine sort of the length of the process and the challenges of that process of, especially for a new industry, but maybe that even helped, but generally just, trying to get data that other people don't necessarily have in the first place. You're sort of the pioneer here. So I can imagine that, added some complexity too.
From the perspective of these companies, right, they have the possibility of competitive disadvantage if their data leaks. They have the possibility of their data being misconstrued by us, the researchers, or misread, mishandled, leaked. So they're taking risks. And we're complaining about the difficulty of gathering this data. But I understand it from a corporate perspective. It's like, well, what's the upside for us? Why everybody who didn't participate is like a free rider. They get the benefits of this report, but they don't actually put their data at risk. And then there's actually the work to collect it. For some companies, that was trivial. For other companies, very much not trivial. They had to like hunt the data down, get it into the right format, and get it to us. All those emails and meetings, like that happened on the other side too. That's a lot of labor for each one of these companies, less than for Margot. But so I want to express our gratitude for the companies that went through that whole process and got us data that fit our requirements and cooperated all the way. Thank you for taking a risk on us and sharing data and spending the resources to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've given a few talks now on this study, and it's one of the first things that I say when I start getting into the study itself is thank you to those 10 companies that were willing to take a risk, because many of them they had really valid reasons not to, but they chose to, and I think it paid off. And it showed the broader community that, hey, this is actually worthwhile. We can trust them, and we can make good use of this study. And I know I have evidence that this is true because I gave a talk at the Bitmain conference in Las Vegas in June, and I had companies. Before we were chasing companies, I had companies coming to me saying, we want to give you data. And that talk got us like 7 more facilities from one of the largest public miners in the world. So, that speaks so much to the value of the work that we're doing, that when you do like that little bit of proof of work, I think it's so important in Bitcoin is to show proof of work. You don't have to show like massive amounts, but just show something that you could take from beginning to end and that it had a meaningful result. I think that's really powerful for this particular community of people. And I think we were able to really show that was possible and with our little proof of work, and now we can do more work and keep building on that. So yeah, just again, really, really grateful, really glad that we could build that trust and not violate it too, and get more companies to appreciate the work.
Yeah, 100%. And then just to kind of like dig further into the actual results of the study, now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, when I first read the report, I think I was initially most taken aback by the sort of Locust and Dung Beetle framing. And I think, that to someone who maybe isn't quite as technical on, the data collection and the emissions and all those things, that sort of framing device was really useful to think about, the differences again between AI, data centers and Bitcoin miners. So yeah, I'm curious what the inspiration was for that. Happy for either of you to take that question and maybe.
I
Yeah,
want
go
to
ahead.
talk about that. It's fun. I like to tell this story because Troy has talked about the dung beetle for a long time, and I think the first time I heard him talk about it was on What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, and I thought it was kind of funny. But then we started talking about AI, and one day we were talking, and I was like, AI is like the locust, and then we realized, yeah, the dung beetle versus the locust, and it was just a really fun moment that I got to share with Troy. It's just like having this phone conversation, and then having this little epiphany of like the comparison of now we could use different bugs to label different types of computing, and and then we started working on the report, and I was trying to come up with a title, and I thought, do this. I'm always really confined by the like technical titles because of my research as a PhD student and academia in general. I thought, why don't we just have some fun with this? I mean, it's a policy report. It's not for peer review so much. Like, it's not like for academics. It's for the public. Let's have some fun. So I just was like the locust and the dung beetle, and then Troy liked it, so we kept it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the number one question that I get, and maybe Margot too, is like, sure, Bitcoin might be good for human rights, or it might be good to have a fixed supply thing that can't be debased by money printing, but it uses so much energy, and isn't that energy all a waste? And the realization that you have when you're in this space long enough and you're learning from actual practitioners who are doing it, but also the epiphany you have when you just realize the fundamental features of what Bitcoin mining is that yes, it uses a lot of energy, but it consumes energy in a totally unique way. It's very sensitive to the price of electricity. It doesn't use expensive electricity. Right now, most machines are in that whatever 8-9 cents a kilowatt hour break even, where if the energy is more expensive than that, it's not cost effective to keep them on. You just turn them off if the energy is that expensive. And it doesn't make sense to set up an entire mining business and buy the machine in the first place and have the labor and everything unless the power price is very low, like probably sub 4 cents a kilowatt hour right now, which is dirt cheap energy. And you realize that like that's not some kind of accident, but it's built into the nature of the protocol that it will be driven to the cheapest energy on the planet in a way that no other consumer of energy ever has. And so this is that dung beetle like behavior. Cheap energy is waste energy. Energy is cheap because nobody wants it. So that's the nature of Bitcoin mining. It hasn't always been true because we go through really periods of extreme price appreciation in Bitcoin, where suddenly Bitcoin miners are able to make money on very expensive energy. But for the vast majority of its history and its trend line, it's driving towards ultra cheap, nearly free energy usage only. And that's that dung beetle-ish behavior. And it's like, so that to step back to the question that we always get, why what yes, Bitcoin seems like a cool thing, or at least neutral, but it uses all this energy and therefore it's bad and we should ban it. What I want each one of those people who ask that question to me to understand is that it uses energy in a completely unique way, where it only uses the cheapest energy, and it can turn on and off moment by moment so as to only use it when it's cheap. And the impact of a consumer like that is very different from the impact of a consumer that's willing to buy energy at much higher prices and can't turn on and off, like a factory or a hospital or a bunch of homes or whatever. So the dung beetle is a metaphor for that whole package of location agnostic, portable, scalable, flexible, price sensitive, that whole cluster of features that makes Bitcoin mining find and use only the cheapest energy in the world. That's dung beetle. And when AI came on the scene, and part of why Margot and I wanted to write about it was, while we're collecting data, AI is exploding, and headlines start appearing about AI, like it's going to consume all the energy in the world, it's going to crush the grids. And we're like, oh, those headlines sound very familiar to us. Those are exactly the headlines that were written about Bitcoin 2 years ago. But people are now captivated by this AI power usage story. What they don't understand is that AI's usage of power is nothing like the dung beetle at present. Instead, it's just constant, and it is relatively price insensitive because AI is so popular right now and the machines are not yet readily available. That it's very, very profitable to do AI compute, basically even on expensive power. And so what we see, Margot and I, is two completely different kinds of consumers of energy with very different impacts. But what most people see is just data centers, like two data centers. In fact, they just equate them all the time in journalism, or even regulators will talk about it. They just say crypto mining and AI and other kinds of data centers, right? They'll just do that conjunction, like they're all just the same thing. Now, the whole point of this report is no, they are radically different. The locust, Margot's metaphor, just descends on the fields of energy and consumes everything, and the dung beetle takes the leftovers, takes energy that nobody else wants. Those have very different impacts on grids, in terms of what you have to build out for generation, in terms of how you manage peak demand, in terms of pricing, and in terms of emissions, just like across the board. So we see it like upstream of all of the facts about the impacts of Bitcoin mining and AI. Upstream of all of that is that they are different animals. They are different bugs, and they have different natures. Their essences are different. Their DNA is different. And in order to understand their impacts, which are varied all over the world, which will vary with time and place, you must understand the DNA of each of these bugs. And once you do, then you have a nice like mental, guide for fitting in all of the rest of the data. So the report tries to establish the two natures of these kinds of bugs: the flexible and the inflexible, the price sensitive and the not so price insensitive, the location agnostic and the not so location agnostic, and then allow the reader to and substantiate that with data, and then allow the reader to think about everything that's downstream of that in terms of effects on grids and emissions and so on. So it's really an attempt to give our interlocutors and readers the perspective that we have, that is the most useful for framework for thinking about Bitcoin mining and AI computing.
Well said. Yeah, I think that question sort of answered a number of questions. I think obviously the framing itself is again useful for folks who maybe don't think about these things in a super technical way. And so I guess going down a similar vein here, what do you say to people who maybe aren't convinced even in the first place that Bitcoin is a reasonable use of any energy? um, I think us as Bitcoiners, maybe we have this sort of blind spot where we ourselves see this as a valuable technology. We understand the use cases. um, what do you say to people, and maybe this is an impossible question, but what do you say to people who maybe don't even see any value to energy use by Bitcoin mining?
Can I tell you about my PhD advisor? So I have a new one, and he's very cool, a really open-minded guy, knew really nothing about Bitcoin. And I have never imposed my personal perspective on Bitcoin on him, never tried to convince him that Bitcoin is useful. All I've done is talk about it a lot. And I've done it with data, and I've given talks about how the protocol works, and I've shown him graphs that are in the report, like comparing the energy use for AI data centers, Bitcoin mining, and I've written things that he's read. And over time, these concepts have all started to come together in his mind. And he got to a point where he was like, okay, starting to understand this, but oh my gosh, the energy use is like awful. And to a new stage where he's like, I think you're onto something. And I mean, well, yeah, I mean, it does use a lot of energy, but I mean, so does AI. I'm like, what? Is that any better? So I'm not trying to. I mean, and I've told him all of the human rights aspects. I've given a talk that included, activists, people who have used Bitcoin to survive being, threatened by authoritarian governments. I've told them about how Bitcoin mining is used in Virunga National Park, and how that's basically fighting like colonial exploitation by paying workers to mine their own, grow their own chocolate and chocolate whatever. You know the story. So I've told him all that, but none of that like really impressed him. But I think the more he sees it and understands it from a technical perspective, it's starting to make sense for him, to the point where having a conversation with him at a pub and saying like, yeah, so Trump was at the convention and people were really excited about a nation state reserve Bitcoin. He's like, wait, isn't that against the whole point of Bitcoin? Excuse me. So he's getting it. Like, he's starting to get it. It's very cool to watch, and I just sit back. I don't like jump on it in any way and like say like, yeah, you're a Bitcoiner now. No, like, it's just the whole, you kind of have to let people get there on their own. And I think just talking about it in a really open, non-judgmental way, showing them like, hey, here's this new thing. I think, I don't know, that's working with me and my advisor. I'm not saying he's going to be a Bitcoiner by the time I defend my thesis, but the fact that he has learned so much and has this new perspective that he didn't have before, and can actually appreciate the work that we're doing. I think that is the best that I can do, the best outcome I can get in terms of people who don't see any value in Bitcoin. It's like, you just want them to see something. They don't have to want to use it. They don't want to have to be, like a hardcore into Bitcoin person who's like, yeah, separate money and state, right? Like, you just want them to be neutral, I think, or just see, okay, yeah, it does these things. It's all right. I can live with that. And I think that's where if I can get somebody to that point, I feel like I've succeeded. So that's been my experience so far in not really orange pilling somebody, but just getting them to go from, oh, Bitcoin is awful, to like, yeah, maybe there's something here.
Yeah, those are wise words from Margot, and it is frustrating when you're way down this rabbit hole of energy use, and somebody is at the very top, like, yeah, but why do any of it? Um, uh, and I should say, if that is your belief that Bitcoin mining is completely worthless and provides no value at all, then yeah, any carbon emissions associated with it, any energy use that's not strictly waste energy, any infrastructure devoted to it, the labor, the materials used to make the miners, like this literally all waste, because in your opinion it produces nothing. Uh, so it's hard to know where to go from there, except to say, in general, who gets to make these decisions about what is valuable? I look around at most of society, and I think most all of it's a waste. I spend a weekend camping, and come back into my own house, and I say almost all of this is a waste. I'm happier with a tent, like in the woods. I'm actually happier. So what am I doing? Why do I have all this stuff? You know? So I mean, I can get myself into a mindset where I'm like, yes, I agree. We should all be living in the woods, and therefore all of modernity is a waste. But do I get to make that call on behalf of everybody else? No, we have this thing. It's called a market where we bid on energy, for instance. And we have people selling energy, we have people buying energy. And people reflect their values about what's important by how much they're willing to pay for that energy. That's how we settle these disagreements in a civil way. We do it with markets. And sometimes we do it with democracy too, where we're just like, we decide we want to pay for something. But markets are a very efficient way of saying what's valuable. We literally trade things like, well, you think it's valuable. How much are you willing to trade for it? Look at the price of Bitcoin. It's like whatever, $60,000 of Bitcoin. We have $1 trillion of value that's reflecting humans saying that's worth more to me than dollars. So what am I supposed to do? Like say they're all wrong and therefore what? That's so weird. I could do the same thing for anything else is traded on any market. So one move is to go to the markets, and another move that I found to be useful is to say it doesn't matter what you think. It's just happening, right? Like Bitcoin mining is just happening. Bitcoin is just happening. People have been telling me for 12 years now that it isn't valuable. You know, my colleagues here, I'm at the college in econ, telling me it must fail, it will fail. They're very nice people. They've been very gracious about my Bitcoin life. But I was hearing this. I was hearing this a lot in 2013 from my colleagues. Like, if you have some Bitcoin now, you should sell it. It's not worth anything, right? Okay, well, it's still around. None of the arguments have changed. It still doesn't have an elastic supply. That supposedly makes it worthless. It's still not backed by anything, quote unquote, that's still making it worthless. Well, it's still here and it's worth over $1 trillion and it's not going away. So can we think about it as in how it impacts our lives and our society? And can we think about, fairness with respect to Bitcoin? Uh, just how it interfaces with every other part of our lives, and set aside the question of whether it's valuable given that it is here. So it's kind of like pot. A lot of people had like some objection to marijuana, like you couldn't convince them otherwise. But one of the arguments at work is like, look, you keep passing these laws and people keep growing marijuana like in their cornfields or in their grow houses or whatever. Like you're not eliminating the problem, you're just complicating it with laws. And so you have the same kind of approach with Bitcoin. So yeah, I've found it useful to just, like, I haven't even done the thing Margot is talking about where I get people to realize it's valuable, but I have had luck with getting people to say, yeah, I guess it's not going away. It's here to stay. Like I've gotten the economists here to say, yeah, it doesn't look like it's going away. So I'm glad you're thinking about it. Right.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, it's definitely an uphill battle in the first place. And, I talk to people in Bitcoin, and they're, after a couple of years, they're like, yeah, I've gotten tired of orange pilling people, so I just kind of
yeah.
Yeah.
Once like Larry Fink started talking about Bitcoin as a flight to safety, I was like, yeah, I don't really have to do this anymore. I mean, other people are doing it.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. That's who better to spread the gospel than Larry Fink, but sweet. So just, as we're sort of wrapping up here, this was intended as a sort of a policy report, right? And so the one of the audiences here is going to be policymakers. At this point, I think mostly been sort of within the Bitcoin industry, but what does it look like to take this to policymakers? What are the sort of intended outcomes? I know there's a list of them on the last page of the report, but yeah, what does a win look like that would come out of this report?
I think a win would be not banning Bitcoin. A win would be not going through with the energy tax stuff that they have tried to put into the budget. A win would probably be just politicians not really worrying about Bitcoin's energy use. I think that would be nice because I don't think Bitcoin's energy use is really any more concerning than any other industrial energy user. And ultimately, the way that you solve that problem is to bring on more clean energy. So maybe another win is that governments say, okay, let's incentivize them to use more clean energy. Let's make it cheaper for them to use it so that they'll use that instead of maybe, connecting to a natural gas plant, rather than saying like, oh, we're just going to ban them from our jurisdiction, right? I think these are nice wins that I would like to see. I'm not really in the camp of, yeah, I want these parties to be pro Bitcoin and to love Bitcoin mining. I just want them to be neutral about it. So if we can convince them to maintain some kind of neutrality and not treat the industry as any different from the other data centers that are out there, for me, that's a win. And it's something that I really try to emphasize in the reports that I write in my research, is that Bitcoin mining is a type of data center, and that's all it is. It's just its end use is a little different. Their profit, their business model is a little different, but ultimately it's just computers, just chips generating heat in a room, and that's it. So that's what they all are, and I think if I can get them to really see that perspective, then that's a win, at least for myself and the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, that's really well said by Margot. I completely agree. Bitcoin mining doesn't need any kind of subsidy or special treatment. It just needs to um, not be taxed 30% on its energy, which is the present DAME tax proposal in the Biden budget. It just needs to be treated like even that tax would be fine if it applied to all electricity users across the board. It just needs to be treated like other users of power. And then I would just add anything that lawmakers can do to incentivize flexibility would be good for Bitcoin mining. Or for that matter, methane cleanup. So the kind of superpower of Bitcoin miners is their ability to turn on and off very quickly and without interrupting an ongoing process and in ways that other flexible users do. Anything that harnesses that is good. We found in our data between 5% downtime and 30% downtime roughly across these miners. That means they're off 30% of the time and they're on 70% of the time at the one extreme and 5% at the other extreme in our data set. That's pretty extraordinary. Other kinds of data centers are up 99.99% of the time. And those miners are shutting down either because the electricity cost is getting too high or because the grid is stressed and they have an agreement with the grid to turn down their miners under those conditions. And so the grid shuts them down. But that is a really crucial ability for intermittent heavy grids, or even nuclear powered grids that have to match a supply of demand, supply of electricity with demand for electricity moment by moment. The usage patterns of electricity are varied throughout the day, and also the production patterns of electricity are varied throughout the day, and they don't always match. And when you have a case of mismatch where you're not producing enough energy during that period, Bitcoin miners can turn down, and that's useful for the grid. But not all market structures incentivize them to turn down during that period. So if we're looking at our 5% side, those are likely miners that are not getting price signals from the grid that indicate that, hey, the grid has a shortage now, and you should turn down because we should make power more expensive for you, so that you'll turn down, and particularly turn down like right at the location you are. The more specific in time and space pricing is for electricity, the stronger the signals to miners to turn off when we need them to turn off, and power is scarce. So basically the other message, along with Margot's, of just kind of like leave us alone, don't worry about us, and build lots of green energy. The other message is take advantage of our superpower, which is flexibility, by promoting market structures that reward flexibility and punish inflexibility. And then we will help you solve your problems of mismatch between supply and demand on grids. And this doesn't just go for Bitcoin mining. Something that Margot and I ran into throughout the report was that there are inklings of flexibility in the AI world. In theory, AI could be flexible, particularly on the training side of AI compute. And there is some control software by the same company that makes control software for Bitcoin, Foreman, that promises to allow AI to take advantage of some of the same grid issues that Bitcoin does. We don't see evidence that that's really happening right now, or the scale at which it's happening is, if it is happening at all, is very, very small. But in the future, it could happen, and it could solve a lot of the same problems that Bitcoin mining is solving for the grids. So we would love to see that those policies put in place, not just for Bitcoin mining, but for computing in general. Like, it would be awesome to have compute move around the planet, basically, with the abundance of energy. It would be great to see humanity harness the excess of intermittent energy production wherever that is, and to harness it with compute, whether that compute is Bitcoin or some other form of compute. Really, Bitcoin is it is the pioneer species, as Brandon Quittem has called it. It's blazing a trail for other forms of compute to follow. So even though we set up the metaphor in this kind of like contrastive way, the dung beetle versus the locust, the good guy and bad guy of energy usage or whatever, we actually think it's more like a scale, and we'd like to see the locust become more dung beetle like. And the policymakers that get in front of this and are mindful of that structure, they'll inspire energy leadership. Energy infrastructure will respond to that pricing structure, and of course we know that energy infrastructure is important to civilizational success. So yeah, there's a deeper message in the report than just about Bitcoin mining. It's like, reward flexibility, take advantage of flexibility where it is, promote it, and ride that advantage to an energy and compute advantage.
Yeah, and just one more thing to add to that point, which is a really important point about the results in our study, is that AI is going to continue to develop. It's going to become ubiquitous It's going to be in everything, I think. And technological deflation says prices will go down. It's going to get cheaper. Profits may decrease, right? There's going to be lots of AIs out there, lots of LLMs and other things that people are using. And I think that means that these data centers will probably have to figure out how to become more flexible. It's going to be necessary because they're going to feel those profit pressures at some point in the same way that Bitcoin miners do. So I think, it's important not just for Bitcoin mining to be used in this way, to be utilized by its inherent load flexibility, but for other data centers to try to find a way to copy that, to behave like Bitcoin miners in order for them to survive, but also to be good stewards of the grid. I think that's going to be really important because we need more renewable energy. It's going to be predominantly wind and solar, and we have to balance that out. And we need loads that are flexible to do that. And so if you incentivize that, and not just for Bitcoin, but for all energy users, now you can have a nice, competition. And then let's see who wins, right? And I think that's the best way to do it, whether you like Bitcoin or not. It's like, well, let's see, can Bitcoin survive this competitive environment for load flexibility services, right? So I think that's a really essential point, such an essential thing to consider after reading the report is how do we expand this out to other data centers? How do we make this possible beyond Bitcoin mining? What can we learn from Bitcoin mining? Because Bitcoin mining really is the first to do this at scale. So we should be curious and see what we can learn from it and apply elsewhere.
And Margot, can you just, before we wrap up, could you just summarize the impacts of flexibility of Bitcoin miners that we studied? Can you summarize the impacts of that flexibility on carbon emissions and say what that means? Because I think that's kind of also part of the headline of the report, and we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss it.
So what we found was a strong relationship between uptime and avoided emissions, which really is just quantifying the emissions that would have been produced if you had stayed powered on. And it's a little bit, intuitive, maybe obvious to say, yeah, if you're reducing your uptime, if you're powering off, you're going to avoid emissions compared to a data center or a building that doesn't. But what we found that was very interesting was actually that the way that you're powering down matters. The behavior of the data center matters. If you're reducing your power only a few times within your downtime period, you're not going to avoid as many emissions as if you had reduced it more often. So in other words, what I'm saying is the more flexible you are, the more you're going to reduce your emissions impact. So we want data centers to be flexible. So actually incentivizing real-time pricing and incentivizing Bitcoin miners to be price responsive is really good for avoiding emissions. And then you have to balance that out. Obviously, you want to coordinate because the grid doesn't want to, grid operators do still want some control. So you have to, there's going to be some optimization there where so that the grid operators can forecast you. But on the other hand, I think that if you're solely price responsive, that's easier for grid operators to forecast because they can just follow the same process you're following. They can say, okay, what's the hash price? What's the break even? Let's take the average network efficiency. They can do that. They can model it and they can stick it into their grid models and they can forecast your behavior. So I think the more flexible you are, let the natural course go in terms of how Bitcoin mining operates, in terms of the price of Bitcoin, the difficulty, and the cost of electricity, you're going to maximize your benefits in terms of avoiding emissions, reducing emissions from your operation, compared to a data center that does not take those things into consideration.
One one thing we read, well before we did this study, was this piece by Josh Rhodes for Lancium by Ideasmiths, claiming that if data centers had a certain degree of flexibility, that they would, on net, reduce emissions for the grid over time. That whatever it was below, if you had more than 70% or less than 70% uptime, and you were flexible in the right sort of way, that the grid could actually have lower emissions than if you didn't exist at all, right? And that study left open the question of how flexible Bitcoin miners actually are, and it was particularly in ERCOT, and it was also, to be fair, about the emissions over time. At any given time, if you have less demand for electricity, or if you add demand to electricity of any kind, you can't reduce emissions by adding demand, right? Like at that moment, that makes no sense. But over time, if you have a highly flexible buyer, you can finance more build out of green energy than you otherwise could, and that can on net decarbonize the grid such that your added load is actually less than the added generation that's green. Okay, so just to clarify, because a lot of claims are made in this space, Margot and I did not substantiate that model or actually engage with that model at all. We are not talking about net decarbonizing grids over time. That's like a different study. That's what Josh Rhodes did. We did show that Bitcoin miners have the capability to provide that kind of flexibility, under the right price conditions. And some of our miners met that threshold that he dictated. Our study was just asking this narrow question of what's the difference between the Locust and the Dung Beetle, like in the moment, or over the course of a day, over the course of a summer, how many emissions are avoided by having this kind of flexibility rather than no flexibility. And Margot did the calculations on this. Margot used grid emissions factors that take into account like where and when the power is used. So it wasn't just turning down a certain percentage of time. It was like turning down at this time, this much right here. And you could have very different impacts with the same amount of downtime, depending on when that downtime is and where that downtime is, right? So something to Margot's credit, this is a study that is very different from just some of the other surveys we've seen of miners where they just like ask them how much downtime they have. This is a study that's fine grained that looked at power usage in 15-minute intervals and substation specific, and then used available emissions factors to calculate avoided emissions by having downtime at those specific places and at those specific times. And so that's what the study shows, and it's a pretty remarkable difference between the emissions of the Locust and of the Dung Beetle, given that analysis. Did I get all that right, Margot?
I think
where's Margot?
Froze on my end, but sounded good to me. And having read the report, I think there was a lot of information here. Looks like she just dropped altogether, but we're wrapping up anyway. So
yeah,
no, 100%. I think this is a lot of additional helpful information that just talking these things out is always useful. But that's everything on my end. Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Margot, even though we lost her. But, I may not be Peter McCormick, but I think got some good information here. And thanks a lot.
There's only one Peter McCormick.
There is no second best.
Appreciate it, Zach. Thank you. Yep. And thanks to Margot. I want to express again my gratitude for the miners who shared data with us, for the donors who funded the study, for BPI for coordinating it. And I want to say also that, Margot really is the brains of this. duo here. Margot's the scientist. I'm a philosopher. I'm widely curious person, but full credit to Margot for doing the intellectual heavy lifting in the report.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Troy. Gonna stop the recording and see you later.